It was so much fun doing the Harry Potter cast last week. I decided to continue on with doing palettes for some of my favorite shows, movies, and series. And this week we decided, and I thought this would be cool, but we're going to do The Office. And I love The Office. I think it's so funny. It's one of my comfort shows. And I thought it would just be really fun to do palettes for all of the actors. So without further ado, let's get into it. So the first character that I decided to do was the world's best boss himself, Michael Scott. So Michael Scott was played by Steve Carell, and it was actually really confusing to do his palette because Michael Scott is such a lively and vivacious, sometimes inappropriate character, and he's just this really extroverted person. And so initially, I thought that Steve Carell was a dark-haired spring, also known as the Vital Spring in my palette system. But then when I studied Steve Carell, the actor, it was very different. He was a little more introverted and a little more pulled back. He also doesn't like to wear a lot of color, which is typical of a person in the spring season. So I ultimately figured out that he was a winter, and more specifically, a winter known as the dynamic winter. Now, a dynamic winter is a winter that borders on spring, but they're still pulled back, and they're not as extroverted as a spring, but they have some of the lively traits of spring. This is why Steve Carell, in my opinion, was perfect to play Michael Scott, because he's so lively and he can just get into it. But the Steve Carell that I watch on interviews, he's very pulled back. Steve Carell also has dark hair and very sharp features, which is typical of the winter season. And so here is his palette, and I hope you enjoy looking at it. And this is Steve Carell's color story. And our next character is Jim Halpert, played by John Krasinski. So John Krasinski was actually quite confusing at first because I thought he was an autumn, because he initially has this kind of warmth about him. But when I studied him closer and I watched him on interviews, he's actually a summer, because he answers his questions on interviews with a lot of thought and a lot of grace, and that's such a summer quality. So I ended up determining that he's a warm summer, also known as a dusk summer. It's a summer that borders on autumn, but is still more in the summer season. So Jim Halpert, he's kind of this steady guy. It's a very kind of summer role. And John Krasinski was perfectly casted for it. And I love watching his chemistry with Jenna Fischer, and who plays Pam. And I will be doing her palette next. So the next palette I did is Pam Beesly, or Pam Beesly Halpert. I don't want to spoil it for anyone, sorry. So Pam Beesly on the show is in the beginning seasons, she's very meek and is purposefully dressed in these very muted colors to just kind of show how suppressed she is, and she hasn't gone through that character growth that she does in later seasons. However, Jenna Fischer off camera is very outgoing, very vivacious, very lively, and she's a total spring. And what was so interesting is that in later seasons, in some episodes, they actually do dress Jenna Fischer in some of her best colors, but it's not till later seasons, and I believe that's to show how Pam really comes into her own. So this palette is called A Sandy Spring, and it's a spring that kind of borders on the autumn season. But the difference between a spring and an autumn is while they're both warm, springs have simpler kind of preferences and autumns have more eclectic and bohemian preferences. And Jenna Fischer doesn't strike me as someone who likes very textured or tapestry-like eclectic things. She dresses very approachable and very down-to-earth. And she likes a lot of very classic and simple styles. So in my opinion, Jenna Fischer is a spring. So the next palette I did was Dwight, or Rainn Wilson, who plays Dwight. So Dwight is a total Autumn character. And Rainn Wilson is a total Autumn actor. So I can see why the casting works, because Autumns are typically very eccentric and quirky and offbeat, and that's Dwight in a nutshell, except for the fact that Dwight has almost lit the entire office on fire in season 5. But yeah, so Dwight is very much an Autumn, and actually Dwight is one of those characters that they do dress in the right colors. And I think it's to reflect that kind of quality in Dwight that's eccentric and quirky and offbeat. And I love just how Dwight's developed. It's cool that he's on a beet farm outside of the office. That's really random, but really cool. And I think they do a really good job in the wardrobe department, really bringing out all of Dwight's eccentricities. And his palette is pretty much what he wears on the show. And I think that's a really cool correlation. So Angela, the character on The Office, is supposed to be portrayed as very severe, and they dress her in the wrong colors on purpose because she's this uptight and severe person. So she wears a lot of grays and a lot of muted tones. But actually, when you separate the actor from the character, Angela Kinsey, the actress, is a spring. If you watch interviews of her and listen to the podcast Office Ladies, she's very lively and very talkative and very charming and very vivacious. She's a total spring. So it was really interesting to do this palette because she's an example of someone who was dressed in the wrong colors on purpose to portray a character. And the character is nothing like her in actuality. So, yes, Angela Kinsey, the actress, is a spring. And I confirm this because I looked at pictures of her wearing coral, and she looks amazing in the color coral. She also looks amazing in turquoise, and that's very indicative of a spring. They look amazing in those two colors, typically. So I did Phyllis's palette, and on the show, they kind of portray her more winter-like, and they dress her in all those jewel tones. But when I look at Phyllis, the actress, she's actually a summer. She's very graceful looking, and I think before she was on The Office, way back when, she was a dancer, and she has a lot of elegance and gracefulness in her features. And so she was definitely a summer, and specifically, she's a rose tone summer, which is just this classic English rose kind of coloring. So she needs a lot of soft blues and purples and pinks. And I think that the show put Phyllis in the colors that they did because they wanted to portray someone at an office. But in actuality, Phyllis's coloring is very much on the muted side. Andy Bernard, played by Ed Helms. So Ed Helms and Andy Bernard are both springs because they're both very lively, charismatic, and very just high energy. And I think it's really kind of funny because they dress Andy on the show super preppy on purpose because he's supposed to play this guy that has gone to Cornell, and he's supposed to be this kind of Ivy League snob. And they do a very good job of showing that. However, in actuality, the actor Ed Helms has a more subdued palette than what he wears on the show. So he's what we call a floral spring, and this is a spring that flows into summer. So another example of someone in this category would be Princess Diana, because they have this quiet but charming approachability, and they look good in the softer colors in the spring season. So it was really interesting to see that on the show, Ed Helms really upped his personality and upped his energy to portray Andy Bernard. Erin Hannon, or also played by Ellie Kemper, is a total Autumn. She looks amazing in these rich, warm kind of colors, and they purposefully dress Erin in the wrong colors because I think they're supposed to show that she's just doing her job working at an office. Again, I think The Office is not a glamorous or fashionable show in the sense that they're portraying an everyday American workplace. But in actuality, Ellie Kemper is an Autumn, and specifically she is what we call a metallic Autumn in palette building because she has this copper red hair. And when someone has copper red hair like that, you have to acknowledge it in the palette by including a lot of colors that are enriched with copper. So Ellie Kemper is a metallic Autumn. So BJ Novak plays Ryan Howard on the show, and it was really interesting to figure out what season BJ Novak fit into because he could be a winter, he could be, but I just didn't think that was right. When I really thought about it more, he really fit what a vital spring is, just like Mindy Kaling. However, the structure of his palette would be different than Mindy's because BJ Novak has very piercing blue eyes. So when someone in the world of palette building has blue eyes or piercing blue eyes, they're going to have a lot of blues in their palette because it brings out the eye. So on the show, he's mostly wearing kind of neutral colors, but when he does wear the bright blues in some episodes, his eyes really pop. And so I made this palette to kind of acknowledge the eyes and acknowledge his natural coloring. And I do believe he's a spring because he's also very lively, and if you listen to him on interviews, he's very engaging, and that's a very spring kind of quality. Meredith Palmer. So this was a really interesting palette to do because I knew right away that Kate Flannery is definitely an Autumn because she has these really unconventional facial features and she looks really amazing in greens, and both of those things are very much in line with the autumn season. And the other thing about her character is that her character on the show, Meredith, very extroverted and very opinionated. And being opinionated is very much in harmony with the season of autumn. They're very opinionated individuals. So right away, I knew that Kate Flannery was an Autumn because of just how well she could get into that opinionated temperament on the show. Since there were so many characters on The Office, I wanted to divide this video into 2 parts for the sake of time. And I hope you all enjoy it. Stay tuned for The Office Part 2, where I will show palettes for more characters that I did. And I really enjoyed making these palettes, and I hope you enjoyed seeing them. And if you want to see more videos, please like and hit the subscribe button and leave a comment. Also, if you have any requests for a series, show, or book, let us know in the comments and we will do our best to accommodate it. Thank you so much. Have a great day or evening or wherever you are. Have a wonderful, rest of your day. But I will see you next week with part 2.